I'm Gitta Ryle. When I was not yet 7, my life changed forever. I heard talk of war, but to a small child it was only noise. It didn't make sense. In March of 1939, my mother put me and my sister on a train bound for France, instructing Renee that she must look after her younger sister. The train pulled away, and we were surrounded by other children, all Jewish. I barely understood what was happening, and my father was already gone. The fear and confusion of that separation would shape me for decades. I remember feeling abandoned and angry that my mother had put me on the train, angry that my father had left, unable to grasp what was happening. I had been my father's little girl, and his absence was unbearable. Only years later did I learn that he had fled to avoid deportation to a labor camp. At the time, I believed he would return for us. He never did. After about 5 years of being moved from one safe location to another around France, Renee and I arrived in southern France, where we were separated and placed with two different families. I felt more alone and frightened. There I saw violence firsthand. The Germans and Allied soldiers were fighting heavily in the region, and from our hiding places, sometimes caves, sometimes cellars, we would hear the shooting. The following day we would see the aftermath, bodies lying along the roads, destruction scattered through the fields and the village. The Germans were dropping grenades and shooting into the basements where we were hiding. We could see one soldier's boots as he approached. I began to feel that life had no value in a world where people killed each other. I no longer wished to live in such a world. I hoped death would come, but could not bring myself to seek it. By 12, I was no longer living, only existing, feeling angry and deeply sad. For years, I carried that pain without having words for it. I built an adult life. I married. I had children. When my own children reached the age I had been when I was sent away, I developed ulcers and experienced anxiety attacks so severe that my doctor insisted I get therapy. In the first session, I told the therapist I didn't know why I had survived the war, that I should have died with the others. I said I wasn't a good mother or a wife. I said I was nothing. Therapy began to slow, painfully process of uncovering a lifetime of suppressed trauma. Each session peeled back another layer, revealing the child who had been abandoned and terrified. The physical pain in my body mirrored the pain I had long suppressed. Gradually, I began to see that my childhood experiences belonged to the past. I couldn't erase them, but I didn't have to keep reliving that trauma. I learned to forgive myself for surviving, for feeling anger, for holding on to a hatred I did not choose. I understood that those who did harm owned their actions. I did not. I didn't need to forgive them, but I could release their darkness from my body and mind. That's how I learned to move from surviving to living. The memories remained, but they no longer controlled me. I carry them as part of my history, not my identity. What began with fear and abandonment evolved into understanding and release. Now, in my later years, I find myself in a place of peace, not because I have forgotten, but because I have learned to remember without reliving. I have made peace with the child who rode that train in 1939 and with the woman I became.
Welcome to State of Mind. Being human and living well.
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 I'm Debra Sloss, producer and host and licensed marriage and family therapist. What we've just heard is the voice of Gitta Ryle, a Holocaust survivor describing not only unimaginable trauma, but something else, something that emerged over time, a way of living with and even transforming that pain. Her story spans decades, from fear, loss, and disconnection to meaning, self-understanding, and a kind of peace that doesn't erase what happened, but changes her relationship to it. Today on State of Mind, we're exploring a concept that helps us understand experiences like Gitta's, what's known as post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth refers to the positive psychological changes that can occur in the aftermath of deeply challenging life events, not because trauma is good, but because of what can happen in the process of rebuilding. It's a concept that invites us to look not only at how we suffer, but how we make meaning, how we adapt, and how sometimes we change in ways we never would have chosen, but we still come to value. Joining us today are two guests who bring deep expertise and lived experience to this conversation. Dr. Richard G. Tedeschi is Executive Director of the Boulder Crest Institute for Post-Traumatic Growth in Virginia and one of the psychologists who originally coined the term. A professor emeritus at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, he spent over 4 decades researching how people respond to trauma and how growth can emerge in its aftermath. His work has also helped shape programs for combat veterans and first responders, focusing on how individuals and communities can move forward, not just by reducing suffering, but by discovering new possibilities. We're also joined by State Assemblymember Gail Pellerin, who represents California's 28th District, including parts of Santa Cruz and Santa Clara counties. She brings decades of public service experience and currently serves as chair of the Select Committee on California's mental health crisis. Gail's path into public service was deeply shaped by personal loss after her husband died by suicide, an experience that profoundly impacted her life and ultimately helped guide her towards service and advocacy. Welcome to State of Mind, Richard and Gail.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Deborah. Glad to be here.
Well, Rich, before we even define the term, I'm curious, when you hear a story like Gitta's, what do you recognize in it?
I recognize the universality of it. I've heard a lot of these stories, and in some ways they're, of course, deeply personal and individual, and in other ways they're very common. This idea of post-traumatic growth, even though a lot of people have not heard about it, it's a common experience, and the way people describe these experiences are often very, very similar.
Now, Rich, you were part of the team that actually came up with the term post-traumatic growth. How does Gitta's experiences reflect what led you to first recognize and study this phenomena?
One of the things that's clear in her experience is that post-traumatic growth did not come easily. It was a struggle, and that's important to understand. So I recognize that part of it, that the whole process that people go through to experience these sorts of changes or transformations is full of pain and difficulty, as people have to reflect on what happened to them and try to figure out another perspective that brings them forward into a life that has meaning for them.
Now, if you're open to sharing it, what do you think in your own life or work initially drew you to this specific topic?
I was always interested in the best of human beings. A lot of psychologists, of course, understandably, and me included, treat people with disorders, mental health problems. We often see people when they're at their worst. We have these diagnostic systems that lead us to label people in different ways with different disorders and all of that. But I was raised in psychology with some people that were really focused on transcend experiences and growth and possibility in life. And so I was coming out of that sort of humanistic tradition in psychology. And then I think that led me to question what makes people wise? Where does wisdom come from? And that's what first prompted me and my colleague Lawrence Calhoun at UNC Charlotte to start to look into how people develop wisdom through some of life's hardest experiences.
And do you think there's anything in your own personal history that sort of set you in that direction?
I think that one of the things that I was involved in that really focused me on this kind of work was I did many years of service in a nonprofit that served bereaved families, especially parents who'd lost their children. And so I did support groups for decades with those people. And I think going further back, I think I was led to be interested in that through my own bereavement experiences. As a child, I lost my father and other very important people early in my life. So I didn't sort of consciously make these choices, but I think in some ways those influenced me.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. For listeners, how do you define post traumatic growth in simple, everyday terms? And what does it actually look like in people's lives? For instance, how is post traumatic growth different from or related to post traumatic stress? And can they coexist?
Well, post-traumatic growth represents changes that people often report as a result of the struggle in the aftermath of traumatic events. These positive changes tend to be within one or more of 5 different domains. We see post-traumatic growth as deeper interpersonal relationships, a greater appreciation for life, new possibilities in life that people might pursue, new priorities, spiritual and existential change, and a greater sense of personal strength. And so these are the types of changes that people talk about. And then at the same time they're experiencing all this, I mentioned that it's a struggle. So people are in distress, and the distress of their lives and the suffering they've been through, that kind of catalyzes these changes so that people are forced to reconsider what they make of life and what's important about it and how to live it well and who they are, their own identity. All of that becomes up for grabs because the things that happen to them make it clear that what they have thought about themselves, their core beliefs about their world, their life and all, no longer hold. And those beliefs have to be reconstructed into some new understanding of themselves and their lives and their future. And so that whole process can yield some of these kinds of changes that I'm talking about. And so because distress gets this whole thing started, we still see symptoms of post-traumatic stress. So those things all co-occur. People can have these symptoms of stress, like avoiding things, being um, hyper vigilant about danger, um, having real negative ideas about themselves and their world, depression and anxiety, all kinds of things. So that can be going on along with these positive changes that start to develop. So that that kind of balance between the two shifts over time, where the positive things start to outweigh those negative things. The positive things start to become more important for people, and so those negative experiences, although they may still exist, um, aren't focused on as much. They're seen as kind of a price to be paid for the positive things that are happening, and people kind of rebalance all of that.
I'm so glad you brought up the shattering of core beliefs because certainly one thing I've seen in clinical practice is when that happens, that's so disorienting for people because those give structure and meaning and shape to almost all their other thoughts. And when those are shattered, they feel quite lost. I've had clients describe they feel like they're in a sea afloat, just treading water and no land in sight anywhere. And so I'm just wondering if you could say more about the shattering of core beliefs and anything about how people navigate that.
Yes, Deborah, that you describe it well, and The core beliefs include things. So we tell you, what are they? I mean, the things that we assume to be true that we never even really think much about because we just think it's reality. So there are things like how much we think we control in our lives, how predictable events are, how benevolent the world is, how vulnerable we are, how safe we are. So there's all these kinds of things that, as you say, events call into question. And when you don't know what to believe anymore, it's very confusing and anxiety arousing. You lose your mooring. And, myself and my colleague Lawrence Calhoun at UNC Charlotte, we've described it as it's like it's like a psychological earthquake. And since I'm talking to people in California, you kind of get it. Uh, so, but it's like the infrastructure we have to live our lives gets damaged, just like a city gets damaged in an earthquake and the electric grid goes down and the buildings collapse. And it's unlivable like that. And our lives become unlivable if we don't have a psychological infrastructure, a way to understand the world and navigate it and live in it. And we got to reconstruct that. And out of that reconstruction can come these kinds of changes that we later view as important and positive and kind of enlightening.
I love that description of the infrastructure. That's just beautiful. So, what actually happens for people who experience post traumatic growth, and what are there specific areas where people tend to see that growth take shape over time?
What happens? Well, one of the things that hopefully can happen, which really makes a difference, is finding some people in your life that can join up with you as you go through this journey that you're on, this terrible journey. So, some people who, um, well, we call them expert companions, the people who provide companionship without acting as experts on your life, who recognize you're the expert on your life and they can't just tell you what to do or how to live, but they're going to be with you and see your value and see your possibility. That's very helpful. And that could be someone in mental health like you, Deborah, or it can be a friend, a neighbor, a family member, a teacher, a coach, a clergy person, just someone who has the knack of being patient, being a good listener, who can hold out the possibilities and have hope for you. Just finding people like that can pave the way for your own future so that you can stand all this distress and then explore and find new things for yourself.
Why doesn't everyone who experiences trauma develop post traumatic growth, even when those possibilities are there? And are there factors that make that growth more likely?
Well, I was just talking about the expert companions. So some people are more fortunate than others in finding those kinds of people. That's one thing. Another thing is um, post-traumatic growth develops sometimes over a long period of time. And so if you don't see it with someone at one point in time, it may be a lot later that you do. So when you take a snapshot in time of who's showing these kinds of changes and who doesn't, you have to recognize everybody's on a different kind of calendar. And so, if you don't see it now, you may see it later. So there's that. And then some people are just overwhelmed by their um, by their symptoms of distress. Some people are in situations in life where they don't have the resources and they're just trying to get by and survive. So, for example, with Gitta, the woman, the Holocaust survivor, there was a lot of time where she was just in survival mode, just trying to even even wondering whether she really wanted to live, but she was living nonetheless. I mean, there was a lot that she had to do just to do that. She didn't have sort of the maybe luxury of considering these sorts of things that lead to growth that she did later on. So at one point in her life, that wasn't happening. Later on, it was. So having the resources available and getting past mere survival. So for example, I work a lot with combat veterans and first responders, and they're very often in situations where they're just they're just having to do their job as hard and horrible and miserable as it might be at the moment. And it's only later that they can look back and reflect and start to engage in some of these processes of growth.
You've been listening to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm your host, Debra Sloss. Today we're exploring post-traumatic growth, how people respond to profound life challenges, and how over time some are able to find meaning, strength, and even transformation in the aftermath of trauma. We've been hearing from Dr. Richard Tedeschi, who helped define this concept, and next we'll be hearing the lived experiences of Assemblymember Gail Pellerin. Back to our interview. Gail, I want to thank you so much for being here to share your story about your husband's death and the impact it had on you. Can you take us back to what happened and what, in your internal experience, were those early days and months like?
Oh, wow. It was devastating. It was November 18th of, I'm sorry, November 19th of 2018 that I learned that he had taken his own life. And it just shook me to my core. I mean, I basically really literally collapsed on the street and just buckled under the emotional trauma of that reality and really not believing it at first. It took me a while to really accept that and not knowing what to do and those early moments and of course needing to communicate that what had happened to our children was the hardest thing I've ever had to do is to tell them that their dad had taken his own life and just those early calls to make to friends family to let them know it was surreal. I felt like I was living somebody else's life and somebody else's reality that this wasn't happening to me and also feeling very so many emotions anger and my thoughts about suicide at that time were very wrong and I've gone on to learn a lot more about why people take their own lives. And I've become somebody who is a voice and a face to openly talk about suicide and mental health and the importance of connecting with your loved ones and really having some serious conversations about how they're doing. But early on, those early days, I did go to a workshop on suicide loss, and the speaker talked about putting your grief to work and I've worked since I was 13 years old, so I know how to work, and and that really resonated with me as far as what I can do to help others who are going through a similar experience and to really understand what happened in our situation and be able to be that support for my kids and um, to be be on this journey with them. And this journey, as we all know, is not flat. It's not one direction, and it's not level. So you'll have lots of ups and downs. You'll have a lot of times where you lose your footing and you go back, and but it's a process and it's something we will carry with us the rest of our lives. And it's always so frustrating when people will say, aren't you over that? Haven't you moved on? There is no moving on. There is no getting over. It is you are now a different person. As you said, that post-traumatic growth that I feel like I went through really made me a different person. And Tom's loss is a part of that. It's a part of my story. And it's something I will carry with me the rest of my life.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. And it's because you speak out about your story that I came to learn about it and ask you to be here with us today. And I know that you are doing a lot in the community to try to improve mental health conditions for the community and for our area. So really, thank you for that. Suicide loss in particular can carry so many layers of shock, grief, and often unanswered questions. How did that loss impact your mental health and sense of identity, Gail?
Yeah, no, it was like I said, those were really very, very difficult times. It's difficult today. It's difficult right now talking about it. I have tissue nearby because I do tend to cry. I get emotional talking about that experience and that reality I have. And I did go through a lot of bitterness and anger, and it's tough when you lose somebody to a to somebody's killed in your life. When there's a perpetrator, you can direct all that anger toward that person, but when it is your loved one, it's especially conflicting as far as who to blame for this. And I originally thought that suicide was a selfish act, that he was doing this just to hurt us. And I've come to learn that that is not the case, that people who take their own lives are truly at the brink of feeling completely and totally hopeless and not seeing any way out to a better day. And basically losing their fear of death and just being so desperate and so hopeless and in such a dark place that that is their only thought of a way out, is to take their own life. So that's made me really think about that moment, that those seconds when somebody's contemplating that and that's an option for them, and how critical it is to have some intervention there and have some other options, like maybe I'll call this person, or I'll call or text 988, or I'll reach out to do something because maybe there's another answer. And um, and then in my work and running for state assembly and getting elected to this position, and oh wow, just hearing stories from people that not always in that area of mental health, but just life stories of people who've struggled with housing and food security and healthcare and getting a job or getting education and feeling just the angst and the depression and the frustration. It's really made me now kind of be thinking a lot more about what kind of world are we all creating collectively that makes it so somebody is so depressed and so hopeless that they think about taking their own life, and how important it is for us to work together to create communities and create paths for people that do give people hope and purpose and a chance to really thrive in this world.
So, Gail, as you listen to Gita's story, especially her description about carrying that pain for so many years, was there anything in that that resonated with your own experience?
So in Gita's story, and it's such a beautiful story, and I'm so glad she's telling it, is that grief will wait for you to address it, to accept it, to bring it into your life. You can't just jump over that. You can't just jump over those traumatic events in your life. You really have to sit with it and hold it. And I'm proof that you can go on and live a productive life, and you could have joy and you could have laughter, but you will always carry that grief and that trauma with you. And in Gita's case, she went on to get married and have children, and thought about there's so much going on with me. What is happening with me? Why am I not feeling as thrilled and happy to be living this life that I've created with this husband? And getting that help, that counseling that she desperately needed, allowed her the opportunity and the space to think about those childhood memories and how traumatic that was, and what an impact it was having on her decades later.
At what point did you begin to notice something shifting toward less suffering and maybe more growth? And what do you think helped you begin that process, Gail?
I just definitely am just so grateful for my family who have been with me every step along the way, and incredible friends. You know, um, calling my best friend from college, when that day occurred, and her first response is, "I'm getting on a plane. I'll be there tomorrow." Calling a friend locally who, "I'll be there in 5 minutes," got in her car, dropped everything, came. Calling my sister, who helped me transport safely my son to our home so we could have time together to address this as a family. I mean, it's just yet it was difficult for everybody to really grasp what had happened, and even more difficult to share it with others. And there's still a stigma around suicide, and there's still people who don't want to talk about and think that something's wrong with you or your family if that has happened. And so that's still real, and I need to continue to this day to respect the privacy of my children, who have a different way of dealing with their grief and their lived experience. But for me, I got a lot of healing out of sharing my story, and um, and spoke about it. At the time I was the county clerk, registrar of voters in Santa Cruz County, and in September, when it's Suicide Prevention Awareness Month, so that was a year later because he died in November, I presented a resolution, and we spoke to the county board of supervisors about suicide and how it impacts families and how we all need to be aware, and we're all in this together to help support each other. And that was a hard thing to do. But I found that people would come to me and say, I'm just so glad you spoke because I too feel this way, or I've had a family member, or, the real heart wrenching ones are the people that are saying, I've thought of suicide myself. And what you said and your words have made a difference. And wow, like that is incredible. That is everything. And that was actually my daughter that got us involved in the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, the overnight walk that they do to raise money and awareness for suicide. And it was in San Francisco, and it was in June. And we raised money, and everyone shows up. You wear beads depending on whether you lost a spouse or a parent or a child, or you yourself had attempted. And you walk the streets of whatever city. We were in San Francisco, and we walked from pretty much 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. Those are hours I typically like to sleep. So that was a really difficult thing. But talk about a life-changing event, to be with so many people out in those streets at that night, at those hours, and sharing stories, and shedding tears and hugging strangers and connecting with people over their story, and really knowing that you are not alone. You are not alone in this journey. And that was an incredible life changing moment. And it was actually the first time my kids were able to say out loud that their dad died by suicide.
I'm so glad you shared about how that shift happened for you, Gail. And that really speaks to what Richard was talking about earlier, the importance of companions and how sometimes those companions are not our friends. They can also be people who share our experiences or who are just moved by our story and decide to walk alongside us by sharing their own stories in exchange. So, Rich, building on what Gail just shared, what's happening psychologically when someone begins to reconstruct meaning, especially after a traumatic loss like Gail's, or when someone's core beliefs about the world have been shaken?
We find that there's several things that are going on, and I think what you've talked about, Gail, is a good description of these things. So if I'm putting it in kind of a framework, one of the things that people have to understand is that their reactions to all this mean that they're humans, that there's nothing wrong with them. They're not broken or disordered, that they're human beings who are suffering. And suffering people have certain kinds of physical experiences and emotional experiences, and that's normal, and they shouldn't condemn themselves as not being strong enough, or something's wrong with the fact that they're having these kinds of struggles. So that's one thing that's important, that people start to realize. And you talked about stigma. That's the thing that prevents people from accepting their own humanity through this. So just this kind of conversation and what you have said helps to change some of that. So that's an important recognition. And then the second thing is people have to find some way to comfort themselves. You have to find some way to do that, so that you're just not ruminating about all these things and in distress all the time and can't function. You have to find, and people find different ways to comfort. So there's all of that. One of the ways to comfort is to disclose about it or express it in some way. And that's at the beginning, that's a very difficult thing. And you described how you getting up and telling that story, just shook you. And it still can. But as you get better at finding the people to talk to and trusting that there are people out there who are receptive, disclosing about this is helpful so that you're not just bearing all this alone and keeping it inside. And then when you do that, you start to realize that this is part of your own story. Your life has kind of taken a different turn, but it's still the story of your life, and you have to figure out, okay, where's it going to go? It's like it's watching your own movie, and this thing happens in the movie. It's like, oh, so where's this happening? Where's this going? What am I going to do? How's this life going to go? So you have to author your own story going forward. You have some decision making to do about, and you, of course, made your decisions about becoming someone who is open about this. And you recognize, you said your children maybe do it a little differently. Everybody's got their way. So you have a story that you start writing yourself about how your life's going to be going forward. And then another thing that's really important that's clear about you, Gail, is that you've taken that and decided to do something positive with it for other people. So is there some way to put it to service, put it to work? Like you said, the person told you, put your grief to work. And the work is not just for yourself individually, but for all the other people who might be able to connect with you because they are suffering some similar sorts of experiences in life. So this is often a very healing thing to do, to find some way to benefit others, to be of service, to have that kind of mission. Um, and that gives meaning to this suffering. So it isn't just useless and mere suffering for no good reason, all in vain. It's it does something for somebody. And and when you tell your story, and you talk about being in the assembly, every time you tell that, something happens with someone. You touch someone. So you start to see that your willingness to disclose, to understand your own story, and to offer it up um, is of service. So those are some of the things that happen with people. And I was listening to you, Gail. I was just thinking about those pieces of that in our research, our psychological research over all the years we've looked at this, show that kind of process. And again, the way you describe yourself is a reflection of that process that we've found in so many people.
I just want to point out that the entire State of Mind program is based on people's impulse to do that. In that all of the guests that come on and share their story, their main motivation for that is to try to help other people out of the struggles and suffering that they've undergone and to try to transform that. So it makes me wonder, Rich, is service an essential element of post-traumatic growth, or is it just a common one?
I think it's essential to maintaining it over time. For example, at our foundation at Boulder Crest, when we're working with veterans, for example, who are coming through our program, we explicitly encourage them to develop a plan for their lives as they go back into their communities, where they use their experience to benefit other people. It might be their family members or their neighbors or in their workplace or in their community, wherever it is, but to have some idea of how to see themselves as instruments for good service and value. And for example, for veterans, that's especially important because a lot of these people, after their service as veterans, they don't know who they are or what to do anymore and what their value is because they're outside of that military community. And it's like they're at a loss. So that's part of the problem. And so finding some way to be of service, and it doesn't have to be a public way like Gail does. It could be a very private way, but to know that you are doing something which benefits people beyond yourself. I think that's really, really important. And there's research that shows that post-traumatic growth is facilitated by the whole experience of giving to others. I talked about before having support from companions. That's part of it. But then there's the flip side of it. Can you be someone who is a companion to others? And that's a very powerful part of the process.
You're listening to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm your host, Debra Sloss. In today's program, we've been exploring post-traumatic growth, hearing both the science behind how people make meaning after trauma and the lived experience of navigating profound loss and finding purpose in its aftermath. With us are Dr. Richard Tedeschi and Assemblymember Gail Pellerin. Every State of Mind episode includes a list of helpful resources, and you can find those in our show notes at stateofmindmedia.org. Stay with us, and we'll be right back after this brief message from our underwriter. Let's get back to our interview. Gail, you say your loss ultimately led you to public service. How did purpose after such a loss begin to take shape for you?
So I think as Richard had said, sharing your story with other people is also good for your own soul. And I realized that there were a lot of people struggling with mental health, and even my own family and our struggles that we had even before my husband's suicide, just accessing good quality mental health services and getting the right counselors and getting it paid for, having parity along with physical health care. I really felt there was this gap in that space, and I knew there were people working on this, but I really felt that serving in the state assembly would be a place where I could really be a voice for mental health care, for suicide awareness, and to garner those resources needed and attention needed in that space. So I originally had hoped that somebody else was going to be running for this position, but it turned out that it was me, and I ran for it. And with that in my heart, that I really wanted to be a voice and a face for mental health. And I felt like I could do some good in the state assembly. And in fact, one of the first things I did when I got elected in January was to insist that the 988 poster be put up in every public restroom that was owned by the state. And I got pushed back on it. They said, "Oh, we'll put it up in the break rooms." And I said, "No, I think it needs to be in every public restroom." Because again, it normalizes it. It says, like, we're putting this up for everyone to see, because the reality is we all have mental health. It's just, are we having, quality mental health, or are we struggling with mental health? And do we have a diagnostic condition that could be treated with medication or not? I mean, so mental health is extremely complex, but just having it out there that if you're having a crisis, there is help, and spreading that message to people, I thought was really very important. And then, of course, continuing to advocate for resources and for funding and for programs that do incredible work in the mental health space. And it's always a battle, and mental health is impacting even our young people as young as 2, 3, and 4 years old are showing up with mental health conditions, and our senior population. And certainly coming out of COVID, that really impacted a lot of people with isolation, and today living in a world that feels very combative, that feels very isolating, that people are there's a lot of anger and bitterness, and a lot of angst, and it's a scary time to be living, and people are feeling that. And we need to have services, we need to be talking about these issues, we need to have mobile mental health care, we need to have places for people to go to get recovered, we need to connect them with the right counselors and care programs so everyone can live their best life.
Well, it's really clear that you took that woman's words quite literally. That you were not only going to put your grief to work, you were going to put it to hard work. That's really clear. So thank you for sharing that. Rich, we've been talking about how growth unfolds. Now let's turn to what this might look like for our listeners who might be in the middle of their own struggle. For listeners in the midst of trauma, What are realistic first steps towards stabilizing and coping? And how important is connection with others in that process, even outside of formal therapy? You've talked a little bit about this, but in the middle of the crisis, what would you say about that?
It is important for people to connect into their communities, however they think about their community, so that they're not alone in their struggles. So people have different kinds of communities that they feel comfortable with and identify with. And it could be just within their family or, within their neighborhood. It could be an organization. So, you might belong to a fraternal organization or a professional organization. It could happen in your workplace. Just find the people who seem to be those that you can trust with some things that may be very private for you. But I think we also come to recognize in these situations that people surprise us, that there are people that maybe we don't really know, who maybe even be strangers to us, who sometimes are those that are most, I don't know, most tender or offer the most support. People just surprise. Just the other day, I had talked to two of my clients in therapy in one day, and both of them talked about how they were just out in their community, and these are people who are struggling, and just an employee at a place. One was a grocery store, another was a, a car place, and in both cases, they reported that someone asked them if they were okay, and just that was like they were seen, like their struggle was seen there, um, and they said it just it just made me feel better in a way that somebody seemed to care a little bit. I It's like I didn't tell them the whole story of everything, but you know, I noticed that there was caring out there just from somebody saying that. So some of the smallest things can make a difference. So allowing yourself to be open and being out amongst people, so those things might happen for you. That's certainly one part of the process.
Gail, I want to come back to you and just ask you, what do you know now about grief and growth that you wish you had understood earlier in your life?
That it's real for everybody, that I'm not alone. And there we're all on this earth, for our time, and we're all on our path. And it's so wonderful to have our people there with us, walking beside us and helping us through, and not just, trying to solve and give us the answers, but giving us that space to feel everything we're feeling. And as I said before, that when you're grieving, when you have trauma, you really need to address it. You really need to carve out that time to sit with it and feel everything that you're feeling, and let those tears go, and and embrace it. Really take it in and really embrace it and accept it, in order for you to be able to move on, and or not exactly move on, but move on with it, carrying that grief forward and using it in constructive ways. So I think that's critically important, that we're all human. We all have, good days and bad days, and giving yourself time to really sit with those feelings is so incredibly important.
So before we close, I want to ask each of you if you could just share a few resources, just a couple that are um, related to mental health or trauma resources that you think are particularly useful and our listeners might like to check out. We'll start with you, Gail.
So one other thing I did after Tom's suicide is I joined NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. It is an incredible organization. I went through the training of, for parents to go through, because that was something I needed in my life. And the peer-to-peer programs they offer as well are so incredibly helpful for people. So I highly recommend NAMI as a resource. I also attended a suicide loss group after his suicide. It took me about a year to find them and be a part of that, but that was a incredible resource for me to be in a room with other people that had a similar loss, and sharing it openly and honestly with each other, and um, basically charting our course for the next week of how we were going to get through our days, and having those connections and those lifelong friends I developed from that group. And then, of course, the American Society for Suicide Prevention is an incredible organization that does great work in this space to connect people with chapters and programs and walks that are so incredibly important for that unified message that we get, that you're not alone.
And we will have more resources on the resource list than those we talk about today. So, Rich, what about for you? Are there specific mental health or trauma resources that you'd like to share?
Well, I do want people to know that our foundation, the Boulder Crest Foundation, has a great website, bouldercrest.org. And there's a ton of resources. There are all kinds of videos, articles, just a lot of resources we have there that you can get by just going on that website of bouldercrest.org. And also, if you are a veteran or a first responder or a family member of those people, all our programs are for free. We have great sponsors that enable us to deliver all of our programs for free, and we have them from coast to coast. So you can get on our website and apply there for one of our programs. You can find out what they're like, and they're like unlike anything else that you experience because they're all peer delivered. They're not delivered by clinicians. They're delivered by veterans themselves, or former police officers, or firefighters, or EMTs, and we also have certification courses for mental health professionals and support personnel. So there's a lot there, and that's a good place to start. And then from there, you'll see listings of all other kinds of things because we're trying to change we're actually trying to change the conversation about mental health in this country to try to help people see that there's all sorts of possibility and growth, even in the worst of circumstances, that's available for people.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Rich, as we begin to wrap up, for someone who feels stuck or discouraged, what would you want them to understand about growth, healing, and timing, and the possibility that this kind of growth is part of the natural human experience?
It is true that it is part of the natural human experience, and it can take time. Sometimes it takes a long time. Don't give up hope on that. And don't think that post-traumatic growth is some kind of destination or you arrive at it. It's a constant process of living in ways that help you see the possibilities that I've mentioned. So you continue to build over time your understanding of how to live well and live meaningfully, even in the midst of ongoing stress and distress. So, so don't think you're not doing it right because it's still a struggle. Keep going and connect with those people who you know you can trust and who believe in you.
Gail, what final thoughts would you want to leave listeners with, especially those who are living with grief, trauma, or loss right at this moment?
So, like Rich said, give yourself time, give yourself the space and the time to deal with it, but know that you are eventually going to have to confront it, grief will wait for you, the trauma will wait for you. And just the importance of sharing your story, if you're feeling that you can, with loved ones, with someone you trust, is so incredibly important. And there's so many great resources out there for people. And to just every day, even on my very worst day, I try to find something I'm grateful for and something that brings me joy. And even on the day that Tom died, in the car with my kids, we talked about our great memories, and there was laughter and there was celebration. So we really need to embrace that and know that you're not alone, and that we see you, and there is hope and there is possibility.
You've been listening to State of Mind, being human and living well.
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 I hope that in listening to today's conversation, you've come to understand that trauma does not have to be the end of the story. That while we would never choose the pain, the loss, or the disruption that trauma brings, there can be ways of living with it, ways of making meaning that allow something new to emerge over time. I want to say a huge thank you to our guest, Dr. Richard Tedeschi, and Assemblymember Gail Pellerin, and to Gitta Ryle for sharing her powerful story. And thanks to you for joining us. New State of Mind episodes are released the first Sunday of every month. You can explore our full archive and all the resources mentioned today and more at stateofmindmedia.org. If you found today's show meaningful, you may also enjoy Episode 67, Courageous Journeys, Healing from Childhood Sexual Trauma, Episode 80, Suicide Loss and Learning to Heal, and Episode 88, After the Loss of a Child, Finding a Way Forward. Stay connected between episodes by following State of Mind on Facebook and Instagram at stateofmind.radio and podcast, where we share visual resources and reflections that build on these conversations. Special thanks to our team, Yusuf Hassanein for audio production and marketing direction, VJ Luca, Austin Gautreau, and Marcella Morton for audio production, Evelyn Campbell for community coordination, Patrice Vecchione for In Your Voice story coaching, Lone Tran for data management and syndication, Tanmai Kadamani and Nika Naik for transcriptions, Priscilla Yee and Grishma Jain for graphic design, Melanie Dominguez and Sarah Eisenberg for research, and thanks to musician Adrian Legg and Favored Nations Entertainment for our theme music. State of Mind was developed and originally broadcast in association with KSQD-FM in Santa Cruz, California. Join us again next month for another episode of State of Mind. Until then, live well.